it's a connection to nature. It's also a good outlet, I find, to experience parts of the country that you wouldn't normally experience otherwise unless you were fishing. And it's a good opportunity to get, food for the plate that you probably, again, fish species that you wouldn't necessarily buy from a restaurant.
Some, people like horses, some people like football, and I, from a really small age, was just fascinated by everything to do with fishing boats, fishermen, fishing gear, everything that I could find out and read or learn or watch and do was fishing. So
seafood is incredibly important to all of us in one way or another. We rely on it for food and income, where an estimated 200 million people have been directly or indirectly employed by the fishing industry worldwide.
Seafood sustainability is absolutely vital. We have obviously oceans covering over 70% of the earth. They do provide a very rich and abundant source of food to humanity. We have a situation where over, I think it's 3.1 billion people get 20% of their protein from the ocean or from fish in some way or another. Overall, that's like 17% of all the protein in the world. So it's a really important source of food, and if managed properly, it is an indefinite source of food as well.
Fish is an important international commodity, and it can provide protein with low environmental impact. So the demand for fish has been growing steadily in developing countries, and overfish stocks have been increasing according to FAO data.
Since the 1950s, global catch of seafood has increased by 386%, which is an extraordinary rise driven by continued population growth and advances in fishing technology. This allows for greater catches of seafood at a reduced effort. In the last 30 years, global catches have stabilised at 86 to 96 million tonnes per year, which is equivalent to 9,504 Eiffel Towers in weight. It is paramount that we find ways to make our seafood as sustainable as possible, as fishing at these quantities can have some serious environmental impacts.
Overall, healthy oceans play a key role in delivering a sustainable future, and they're indispensable for human life. For us to have healthy oceans, we need to have healthy fauna within.
Many of the ways that are the best to catch fish are also incredibly destructive. So bottom trawling and dredging are great ways of catching large quantities of fish. But right from the beginning of their use, people in the fishing industry recognized that there was an awful lot of bycatch, there was habitat destruction going on, large numbers of juvenile fish were being caught. And so there was a lot of controversy over the use of these gears, and yet they're still used today. They're still controversial today, and they're still undermining fishery sustainability today.
Anything is sustainable at the right scale. So even if you're fishing with kind of dynamite or something, there's only one person doing it in the whole world, so it's probably sustainable. And this is a debate that people often have about trying to compare small boats and perceive them as good, and then huge super trawlers as bad. And I think a lot depends on the kind of intensity and the overall impact. So if you had 1,000 small boats or one big boat, which has the greater impact on stock? The answer is probably the same, because they catch the same amount. So it's hard. And again, I think the same with fishing gears. There's some fishing gears that I would think would be totally unsustainable, used in the wrong way, on the wrong type of ground or the wrong type of species, but in another area they might be totally applicable to that type of fish. So it's a really complex subject.
In using fishing methods that damage the environment, we undermine many of the other values of marine ecosystems for people. For example, the disruptive influences of seabed trawling and dredging to catch shellfish and fish can reduce the capacity of the sea to take up carbon from the atmosphere and store it in the seabed sediments. And so, we're ignoring that kind of impact.
There are lots of examples around the world where fishing has been unsustainable. We have seen fish stocks collapse. And I sort of liken it to, having money in the bank. If you run down the capital too much, you don't get any interest from it. And that's really the interest is what we should be sort of living off as, in terms of seafood. It's harvesting the sort of production of the fish, but keeping the capital in the bank so that you still get high levels of breeding and recruitment each year. And so in those cases where fish stocks have been really run down, obviously you're not getting that. And that doesn't just affect those fish stocks in particular, it can have knock-on effects up and down the food chain. So, small fish, for example, are really important as a food source for larger fish and even top-level predators and birds and mammals and things like this. But likewise, if you take the top-level predators out, that can cause a sort of imbalance in the food chain as well. And you never know what might happen. For example, up in the Baltic Sea, there's strong evidence that the overfishing of cod there has actually been an important force in algal blooms, for example, because of the interactions in the food chain.
The fishing industry is a victim of its own success. One thing that fishermen are very good at doing is finding better ways to catch fish more efficiently at lower cost. And because they have continuously innovated over time and found better ways of catching fish, that has concealed declines in fish stocks. And that means that we're not acting soon enough to intervene to protect and recover populations that are being exploited. Instead, that innovation in the industry has concealed the declines that have taken place. And the result is that by the time we begin to see problems, those problems are really rather severe, and there's oftentimes fish stocks have been depleted by to maybe a fifth or a tenth of their original abundance, and they are much less productive than they should be.
It is a degree of scale, I think. Some of these boats that sit on the 6 nautical mile limit in the British waters are 130 meters long, and they would catch in a day what maybe as artisanal small boats will catch in a year. So the scale is, in many things, important, and I really feel it's very important in fisheries.
The fishing community is full of people who do it industrially, and that's their livelihood and their commercial side of it. And I think it's a difficult balance between what's maybe not even ethically right, but what is sustainable. And then at the same time, it's all very well putting plans for the future with, no catch zones and stuff, but at the same time, it's still someone's livelihood. So there's a really delicate, complex, almost impossible fine line to walk.
With the population set to increase by an average of 81 million people per year, wild-caught fisheries alone will not be able to make up for seafood demand. Aquaculture is the farming of aquatic plants and animals, most notably species such as salmon and some types of shellfish. Currently, aquaculture contributes 46% of the total global seafood production, but fish farming can come with a lot of problems.
Aquaculture, again, is a mixed bag. Like, I personally have some issues with salmon farming. Many of the practices that go on up in areas like Scotland, for example. I think the biggest problem for me is the fact that the issues with salmon farming have been highlighted many times. There's been in Scotland a parliamentary inquiry saying, you need to really clean up your act. They made 70 recommendations, and they've largely been ignored by the industry, and the industry is still continuing to grow. And that's just not good enough.
aquaculture, just because it's a newer and it's so important in terms of kind of feeding a growing world population, is newer, and there's still a lot of work to be done in terms of the technology that's being used and problems that need to be fixed, and the kind of feed that goes into it. You know, we've already come a massive way in terms of reducing the feed to output ratios down to almost 1, which is fantastic. But in terms of thinking about sustainability as a whole, then I think wild capture is a more kind of more sustainable choice for me.
Wild capture is and will continue to come under pressure from farm fish. Some countries in the world where, you know, they don't have the kind of ethical standards or all sorts of other standards that we would have, can farm fish protein very, very cheaply, and that will compete. And I think there'll be ever pressures that will come to bear on us as fishermen.
When managed incorrectly, finfish aquaculture can have many ecological problems, ranging from habitat destruction to antibiotic resistance to chemical and waste discharge, as well as impacting local food webs through escaped invasive species, spreading diseases, and the use of fish oil and protein in feed, which puts greater pressure on wild populations. However, aquaculture is not all doom and gloom, with some good farmed alternatives, such as bivalve farming.
I think one thing I definitely support is more farming of shellfish. So these are things like scallops and mussels and oysters, because you don't need to feed them. They actually clean the water by filtering it to feed, and then they absorb carbon as well. And finally, they provide habitat for other species in the way that they're grown. So they actually, you know, probably have a net environmental benefit. So that's a great seafood choice.
Shellfish, things like mussels, are probably the most sustainable choice, and that's because they can be grown very easily without much human input. They don't really require any food, and they're actually quite they're very good at cleaning the water that they exist in. So, for example, you can get situations where you'll have mussel farms not far from salmon farms, and they can help to kind of remove some of the excess nutrients that are in the water. So they can actually be quite a positive thing.
Eco-labels have been used since the 1990s as a way to inform customers that a particular product is considered sustainable. It is also a way to allow customers to include the environment when making purchasing decisions. Eco-labels can be used on any type of product, from cleaning commodities to food. Some of these labels represent official certification schemes that are regulated and standardised, such as the Marine Stewardship Council. Other labels are completely voluntary and claim to be sustainable without any management. The sheer amount of eco-labels today and their different meanings can be quite overwhelming.
There's a lot of different kind of labeling that goes on with seafood. It's not kind of common, and that kind of often causes confusion. You know, what does it actually mean when there's a label on a product, and how does that kind of feed into sustainable seafood?
I think eco-labels are a good idea in principle, but they have to be trustworthy. And so if an eco-label claims something, those claims have to be demonstrable and justified. And I think that's where many eco-labels fall into trouble. The Marine Stewardship Council is a sort of famous example in the fisheries world, and it's designed to identify seafood to consumers which has been taken from healthy fish populations, which has been taken with very limited damage to the environment, and which is subject to good governance by industry and regulators. And if all of that were true, then it would be a very fine eco-label. But unfortunately, once you start looking under the bonnet of fisheries certifications by the Marine Stewardship Council, you find all kinds of problems. There are fish being taken from overfished populations. There are fisheries that are being certified subject to conditions which are not being met. Then they're being recertified despite the conditions not being met. There's excessive levels of bycatch which are being dismissed because they don't involve endangered species, but you know, an animal is an animal, and killing a lot of wildlife in the pursuit of a target species is probably something the consumer is not going to expect to be happening if they're choosing a product that has this eco label.
One of the biggest ones is the Marine Stewardship Council, and it's not 100% perfect. And the reason for that is it sets the standards that then fisheries are assessed against. It doesn't actually do the assessments itself. And I think occasionally things get through that, you know, are not ideal, and probably the MSC is not even happy with some of the things that get through. But there are lots of checks and balances, and sometimes when that happens, the fisheries lose their assessments. And I think that's the other really important sort of side of the coin here, is that eco labels like the MSC drive change. You know, they've certified over 10% of the world's fisheries, and in many, many cases, the majority of those, the fisheries have had to improve their practices. So they've had to, you know, perhaps adapt the way that they're fishing. They've had to change their gear. A classic example of this is with the Namibian hake fishery, where previously seabird bycatch was a real issue. So they started to do things like put streamers on the lines to scare the birds away, set them at night, set them with heavier weight so they sunk down more quickly so the birds couldn't get them. And that's massively reduced seabird bycatch in that particular fishery.
I think eco labels are important as far as the general public. I mean, there's a great deal of the general public which haven't got this huge kind of, I don't want to say huge, but a knowledge, in-depth knowledge of modern fisheries and even to a degree fish species. So if you're going to a shop and you're buying a frozen packet of just white fish, it doesn't even say what kind of, on the front, what kind of fish it is. I think having an eco label or a label that is some accountability, people can then shop and still at the same time know that they're not having the biggest detrimental impact that they could be.
I think eco labels are really important because, you know, for the average person, they don't have time to research every little bit of seafood that they might choose in the supermarket. They might be in a hurry. They might have, you know, a couple of kids like tugging at their sleeves. You know, you don't have time to sort of open up your internet and do all the searches that you might need to do. So eco labels provide that clear information to the consumer in a really accessible way.
If it's just a label tick box exercise, the world won't change, the planet won't get better, the oceans won't get healthier, nutritional content won't be better, we as humans won't live better. So somehow it does have to be a change that's much more difficult to effect, but does come from a place of greater integrity.
I think we will get to a point where people are able to walk into a supermarket and have the knowledge they need to be able to kind of pick up those products. I think it's going to take a long time to get to, and it takes ultimately consumers to drive that change. As consumers, we hold most of the power when it comes to the shopping that we do and the products that we want. If we give quite clear messages to the people who are providing our food that we want better choices for protecting our oceans, then that has to be followed, and that will be delivered.
I think if I was to say anything to consumers, I would ask them to buy British caught and landed seafood. That would take them down a pathway where they would have to become a little bit more adventurous in what they eat. I think a lot of people don't realise, you know, the amount of imported fish they're eating. So they think, you know, because they're buying from a UK retailer that they're buying from British fishermen, often that's not the case. So, you know, we could do with the help to eat some of the fish that we catch, and not at the moment, you know, we export what we catch, we import what we eat. So something to have a better balance, I think, would be good.
For as long as we're focusing 80% of our consumption efforts on just 5 species, some of which are farmed, some of which are imported, the ecosystem is not going to heal, and the coastal communities benefits to society is not going to be felt. So consumers have to be much more experimental with their consumption, with their purchases.
Find out as much as you can about what you're eating. It's not possible to just say, here's one which has been certified by an eco label, therefore it must be good. I advise people to kind of choose species which are low in the food web, which are abundant, which are caught with fishing methods that produce very little bycatch, and that do little harm to the environment. So that means shoaling species like anchovies and pilchards and herring and mackerel. It means farmed species, which are farmed shellfish, so things like mussels, which have been grown in areas where they basically feed themselves, so they're not being fed with wild fish caught from the open sea, as many other forms of aquaculture are, but they're feeding themselves. They're doing us a favor by cleaning the water at the same time. So that's a good kind of choice. One-by-one fisheries can be good as well. So things like tuna, pole, and line fishing is a good way of ensuring that you have pretty limited problems with the environment as well.
If I was to give advice to the general public in picking sustainable seafood, I would say be inquisitive, question what you're buying, what you're looking at, ask whoever you're buying from. The fishmongers, even in supermarkets, are incredibly knowledgeable. They'll be happy to kind of answer questions about where the seafood has come from.
Keep pressuring who you source from, who you buying from, because having customer requests actually does help driving change internally. And then the other thing that I would say is keep being an advocate for sustainability overall, not only with businesses, but also with your peers.
I really hope and I want to see British consumers saying, actually, I want to choose British seafood, which is better in terms of carbon footprint and better in terms of freshness and all of those kind of things.
I can see oceans flourishing with life as long as we stay and follow scientific advice and align our targets with what science is advising.